I'm Nia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the YDSA national co-chairs, and I'm also on the Winter Conference Committee. So we're all here because this is our pre-event for the 2021 YDSA Winter Conference. It's going to be the last weekend in February this year. It's super exciting, and it's one of the most inspiring and fun events that YDSA puts on each year. It's really great to be able to meet all your comrades in person, and obviously on this year we're going to be on Zoom, but we're going to be recreating that same amazing feeling that you get when you get to meet your comrades in person from all across the country. It's definitely one of the things I look forward to every year, and this year we have so many amazing panelists, workshops with really inspirational and exceptional leaders from all over YDSA and DSA who are working on really important political questions right now. It's obviously been one of the most rough and crazy years that most of us can remember. And so Winter Conference is a great place to learn how to accomplish goals that you might have in your chapter or just like personally through organizing, through socialism. And if you are interested in what we're talking about today on this call, or you want to get more involved, please make sure you're registering for Winter Conference, which again, last weekend in February, or also registering for our Cancel Student Debt campaign to be a volunteer. That's also something that is really easy to get involved in, and I highly recommend it. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Emmaline to get us started. I'm glad to see all of you here. Thank you so much.
All right, hey everyone, thanks so much. So we're here with some really amazing panelists tonight. So we're joined by Astra Taylor, who's an author, filmmaker, and a co-founder of Debt Collective. Herrine, who is also a co-founder of Debt Collective, as well as having developed the legal arguments for debt cancellation at the federal level. And Melezia, who is national coordinator of the Cancel Student Debt campaign. So we're hopefully going to have a really great discussion tonight. I'm Emmaline, by the way. I'm on the YDSA National Coordinating Committee, and also in Columbia YDSA, which has been leading a tuition strike. So yeah, without further ado, I'll get started with some questions and just to sort of lay out the agenda for tonight. So we're going to start out just with some pre-prepared questions, but you can start dropping audience questions in the Q&A. And please in the Q&A and not the chat, because it might get a little crazy in the chat. And I'll keep track of that and then start doing audience questions towards in about like 40 minutes or so. So yeah, without further ado, so I'm going to start with this first question that I have, which is, why is student debt cancellation an important demand for socialists to make? And I'm going to pass that over to Astra first.
Hey, everyone. I just want to say thanks so much for having me. Hi, Emmaline. Hi, Nia. And how honored I am to be speaking to YDSA right now, and how just excited I am about your movement, and excited that you all have signed on to cancel student debt as a big campaign. I think that that's just fucking awesome. And the more the merrier, because we need lots of people involved in this if we're actually going to get it done to the degree it needs to get done. So yeah, why is this a socialist demand? I'm a socialist, and I see this as something that is part of a broader socialist politics. I mean, I think on the one hand, basically, as socialists, we're trying to figure out how to wield economic power to change economic relationships, right? To change the political economy, to change how public goods are provisioned, to make public goods actually public. Because part of what we're pointing out in this whole conversation about education is that, what we call public education isn't really that public. It's privatized. It's funded by tuition dollars. So just on a big picture level, I would say, part of this fight is that canceling student debt points towards how education should be financed. It shouldn't be financed by forcing people to take out loans to pay their tuition. It should be funded with public money as a public good. It should be decommodified. So that's what we're ultimately trying to get at. So in that sense, I see student debt cancellation as, yes, part of a slippery slope, ideally towards socialism. And then again, it's this issue of power. So what the Debt Collective is concerned about is, or what the Debt Collective is motivated to do, is try to find new forms of economic leverage, right? So I personally believe that, we need to organize in all sorts of ways. We need to organize in labor unions and build strength in the workplace. We need to organize in tenant unions, build strength as renters, but there's this enormous potential to build strength as debtors, because what's happened to the economy over the last 40 years or so is that we've been forced increasingly to debt finance what should be public goods, which should be provided by the state. So we have to borrow to get an education. We have to put our medical bills on our credit cards. We have to put food and necessities, on our credit cards, or take out payday loans or whatever it is, because we're not paid enough in the workplace. So this is a mode of organizing. The Debt Collective is a union for debtors, and it's based on this idea that, debt is money, right? Your debts are someone else's assets. And so is there leverage that we can wield collectively if we come together? So for me, socialism is both a vision of the future, it's a vision of the world we want to live in, but it's also, it also is a way of thinking that points you towards strategies to fight for that. And debtor organizing is part of that project. The Debt Collective has been organizing around student debt for as long as we've existed. That's sort of been our core campaign, even though we deal with other types of indebtedness. But I see this as, very, a project that just absolutely has overlap for people who consider themselves socialist and want to live in a very different world than the one we live in.
Amazing, thanks so much. We use that so much. So the next question that I had is, what are the causes of rising student debt, and who benefits from student debt? And I'm gonna pass that to Luke first.
Hi, thanks, Emmaline. I want to echo Astra and say I'm super excited to be here. I'm super excited about all the work y'all are doing. I was just talking to my partner about how awesome it is to be able to just come into a space where people are mobilizing, doing the work already, having these conversations, and just be able to start right into the conversation. So the short answer to why student debt is rising so quickly is the sort of inverse of Astra's answer, which is that we don't have a public commitment to fund higher education. And increasingly, higher education is, more people go to college in part because in order to make a living wage or a stable wage, it's increasingly required to have a higher education, which is a labor market policy that's totally contingent, but it's encouraged a lot of people to go to education regardless of the cost. And there's been a whole lot of discourse around the necessity of getting a higher education and the sort of the quality of the investment regardless of the amount of debt one takes on. Which is starting to come apart in recent years, but that's been very much the narrative. The sort of standard empirical narrative, and this is not wrong, but there's a reason why it's worth qualifying, is that the reason higher education costs so much is because of something that economists call Baumol's cost disease. And that means something like, whereas in other industry, you can make production more efficient, you can't really make college more efficient, although they've been pushing for putting education online, and maybe we'll see how that goes in the near future, for a long time. And so what happens is the relative price of college goes up, of goods like college and also goods like orchestras, right, which require the same amount of cost regardless of how you provide it, go up over time as the cost of other things go down. So they look like they're really expensive relative to other things because the cost of everything else goes down. But the sort of shortcoming of that version of the story is, well, if we collectively prioritize educating each other, then the sort of relative price of the college goes up, but if it's publicly funded, then that's not tuition dollars that go up, right? That's a collective decision that the prioritization is we should spend less time working and more time getting educated and teaching each other things. And in fact, this was recognized by the Truman administration. The Truman administration issued a report in the late 1940s that talked about Baumol's cost disease before it was named that, and said, hey, we're getting productivity is increasing in all these industries. That means we have more collective surplus, and we should make the collective decision to invest that in education. And we still have a huge amount of money left over. So that was known right in the 1940s, but it's been ignored for a number of reasons. And so that's one version of the story. And then the layer on top of that is, it's not just that higher education hasn't been funded, it's been the gap between what people can afford and what it costs to provide higher education has been filled with debt, with publicly funded student debt, which is not, judged, it's not given out based on somebody's ability to pay in the future. And so what that done is it's encouraged colleges to continue to raise prices and to raise prices faster and faster over time, because they know that somebody's always going to cover the cost regardless of anybody's ability to pay for that tuition. So that sort of accelerated that rise. Now, who benefits from this? I'll just briefly say, I've already said too much, I think, which is just, there's all these people who make money off of student debt: servicers, debt collectors, certainly college administrators, and, to some degree, college professors, although that's been an increasingly precarious job. It's an increasingly unequal job. But mostly, administrators and debt collectors, but not that many other people. I mean, it's honestly not something that really, that benefits that many people if you think about it relative to just public funding or direct funding of higher education. Unlike a lot of other forms of debt, it's owed to the federal government. Most of it is owed to the federal government. There's some private debt that are owed to private lenders, but most of it is owed to the federal government. And what that means is it's basically just a weird form of taxation that is badly targeted. And so it's mostly just, not beneficial to anybody. Okay, I think that's enough from me.
Hi, this is Melezia Figueroa here. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about sort of who benefits, and then, again, proportionate to who is being the most impacted by student debt. We talked about, somewhat about public debt. There's also public debt servicers like Navient that is making tons of money from collections and other kinds of things. But, on the other hand, we also have a lot of predatory loan companies. I don't know if anyone has been, in the pandemic watching daytime TV, but it's sort of chock full of these ads of come get a student loan and come to a for-profit college. And that's really resulted in Black and brown borrowers, especially having up to 3 times as much debt burden as their white counterparts. A lot of Black and brown folks don't have that intergenerational wealth, so that they end up borrowing more in order to even get through both the living expenses and the expense of college. And student debt also follows you all of your life. It is the one kind of debt you cannot erase from your credit score. So, for your entire life, I am one of the many, up to 1 in 4 involuntary debt strikers, as it were. Even before the COVID moratorium, I could, if you're faced with a choice between eating and paying your student loan debt, guess what's going to win out every single time? But this follows you your entire life, and seniors, especially, your parents and grandparents are also really affected by it. In 2015, over 40,000 older borrowers had their Social Security garnished due to student loan debt. 37% of borrowers 65 and over are in default. So it's not just an issue that affects young people, it affects families. So when we say something like 46 million Americans are in student loan debt, what that really means is and their families, right? And so these knock-on effects impacts are really much very disproportionate to the small percentage of people who are getting benefits.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. 100% agree with everything here. I think it's important also to understand the history of debt in a really blunt way as a political project by the right. So if you go back in time to when Ronald Reagan was the then governor of California, he very pointedly attacked public education. Why? Because there was student action, sort of like the Columbia tuition strikers today, right? There were these students and they were doing political things. So there were, of course, the Berkeley free speech movement at Berkeley, and then the Black Panther movement was emerging at the what they call the junior colleges, right? So at these free, and college in California then was free. It was part of this beautiful plan to offer various types of public education, right? And Reagan said, the state should not be in the business of subsidizing curiosity. And also, I'm going to kick the bums, off. I'm going to kick these welfare bums off campus, right? As though, anticipating also his war on all forms of social welfare. But it was a very conscious thing for these neoliberal economists basically to say, this should not be, they didn't think there's anything, society didn't exist, right? But also that debt would have a kind of disciplinary effect, right? Kids would stop protesting. You'd stop just taking all of these classes and things you were interested in if you knew that you were going to be paying for it for decades down the line. So I think it's really important to note, just to note that there's also these psychological effects, right? Because when you have to debt finance your education, first off, people who are borrowing are going to be paying more than the children of more affluent parents who just pay up front, right? Like if you pay more over time with interest if you've borrowed. So it costs poor people more, which compounds social inequalities. But it makes you think about your degree differently. You have to think about it as a commodity, as like career training. You're going to get a return on investment. These are things that socialists should object to, right? I mean, this is part of why we object to this model of debt financing education, because in my opinion, it corrupts what education should be. But we have to recognize it's part of a conscious political project, the system that we have right now. And I just want to echo Mel's comments about this not being a personal and individual issue. I think also this is a point that socialists should really grasp. This is a social problem. The myth of the loan contract, right, is that it's like two equals shaking hands. It's like, yes, I will borrow this, and yes, I will pay it back. In reality, right, I mean, I signed my first loan at 17. And I'm signing it in the context of this massive economic system. These are not relationships of equality. So let's not pretend that it is. And like many people, I actually took my student loan and I gave some of it to my family, right? Because that was what was needed at that moment. I actually ended up giving some of it to my parents. And so these debts, or parents borrow for their children. We have tons of members in the debt collective who have parent plus loans. Actually, they're indebted for their children. So it's a household issue. It's a social issue. It affects entire communities. So we need to interpret it and analyze it and act on the fact that this is actually a social issue. This isn't just about individuals, who want their debt canceled. This is about
All right, awesome. So I think you froze for a second for me. So the next question is, what is the legal legislative basis for student debt cancellation? And I'm gonna pass that to Luke first.
Hi, yeah, okay. This is familiar ground for me. So the legislative basis for student debt cancellation is just Congress would have to pass a law. That's pretty straightforward. And there are a couple bills out there that have been drafted that it would only cancel a fraction of student debt. So, the Sanders bill would cancel all student debt, public and private. And it would basically do it by having the Department of Education cancel all debt that it holds, bring all Fell loans and Perkins loans into the Department of Education, cancel those debts, and then also purchase private student debt and cancel it. The Warren bill would cancel, I think, up to $50,000. I think that's still her number. But I think the harder legal question is, well, could we do it without Congress? And my answer is yes. And the basic legal justification is that the Department of Education has had the power since it was created to compromise or waive or release or modify claims against anybody, including claims against student debtors. And so debts that are owed to the federal government, to the Department of Education, are claims of the federal government against private parties. And there's nothing that limits the Department of Education's power to cancel those claims, to write them down, to reduce the amount that's owed, or to cancel them altogether. The DeVos administration put student loans on pause, originally citing this power. Although once the relevant officials in the administration realized that they were opening the door to full debt cancellation, they backed up. They found another authority, which they also creatively interpreted, which is it's not a terrible interpretation, but it's creatively interpreted. And they said, oh, no, that's not what we meant. We didn't mean that authority. We meant this other authority. And by the way, on our way out, before we leave the administration, after DeVos has left the administration, somebody from the general counsel's office is going to say, well, we actually don't believe, we're going to write a whole legal memo about how that's the problem. So all of which is to say, they're a little bit scared that this is actually a real possibility, and insisting that it's a real possibility, insisting that they focus on the legal claim is a real point of pressure, I think, right now. And certainly that's true for the Biden administration. My last understanding of the Biden administration is that they genuinely haven't decided what they're going to do with respect to student debt. They want to keep the status quo. They know that the status quo is non-payment of people with federal loans. That's not true for private student loans. Everything I'm talking about with the executive branch power is only pertaining to federal student loans. But they realize that, the status quo is people aren't paying. Well, you can't be the president who's responsible for making people start paying their student loans again. So I think basically what they're doing is trying to figure out if they can get it through Congress, and they're trying to go back and forth to see who will do it. But putting real pressure on the administration, and there has been a good amount of pressure, I think it's a real pressure point right now. So that's the basic explanation.
Yeah, another legislative tool that I want to add on there too is Ilhan Omar's College Debt Student Cancellation Act of, at that point, 2019. I think she is planning to reintroduce it into this new Congress, and that's really for full student debt cancellation. A lot of, again, like the Warren bills, the 50K, 30K, et cetera, while in the context of COVID stimulus, can be, yes, an immediate relief for a lot of people. I think, the 30K and that was proposed in the HEROES Act last year would have totally eliminated debt for about a third of borrowers. But the one thing that we do need to really push is that, okay, while that is a step, it really needs to go to full cancellation, because if think about again, I'm coming from the perspective of communities of color who maybe there's people who are going to be doctors and in healthcare professionals that have to take out a lot more than 30,000, a lot more than 50,000. If the precedent is just placed at a partial cancellation, then I think that would have a chilling effect on people who might not want to go into professions that's going to cost a lot. So all of this has to be addressed together. Omar's bill, again, when it gets reintroduced, it has not been yet. It had, I think, up to 15 co-sponsors, and our coalition has been doing a lot to get more co-sponsors onto that House bill. And so that's another legislative mechanism that we can really put pressure on, our own representatives and others to sign on to.
Yeah. So I absolutely love Omar's bill, and I if I had the power, we would pass it and more. I do think, I'm sorry, saying I have a bad internet connection, y'all. But I think that part of the debt collective's emphasis on executive action, right, is that we have a dysfunctional government, even with Democrats in power. I mean, I don't have to, tell everybody about the filibuster and just how the chances of passing the sort of bold legislation that we need to have a basic dignified humane society is, a challenge. So I think it's important to, call out the power that the people in power possess, right? And Joe Biden and his administration have the power to cancel student debt. I mean, there are some lawyerly concerns and it might be challenged in this or that, but this is something, I just think it's important to understand that that's the context. I mean, there might be student debt included in the Relief or Recovery Acts, or, as part of something. But, the HEROES Act, the Democrats they negotiated with themselves and chipped away at what they were offering. So I just think it's important to emphasize that this is something that can be done, just very directly, without dealing with the dysfunction of the Senate, right? And that's really important. And just saying, you have this power, and that means that if you're not doing it, it's a choice. That not doing it is a choice. And don't pass the buck and blame the Republicans and blame the other side, which is what they love to do.
I think that's a great segue into my next question, which is, how does the start of the Biden administration impact the movement for student debt cancellation? And I'm going to pass that to Luke first.
So I think we've forecasted some of this. One thing I'll add is that, I think that Chuck Schumer, who's not known to be a big progressive leader, jumped on this issue and jumped on a number of different progressive issues, in part because he maybe thinks that he's going to be challenged by a socialist in a primary in the future, namely a particularly popular socialist from New York. But also, I think he realizes that, it's worth getting stuff passed to make people's lives better and avoiding Congress. And he knows that Congress is a problem. And maybe also he doesn't want to be responsible for it. He wants to put pressure on Biden. And I think that creates an interesting dynamic because the Senate Majority Leader wants Biden to do something and is going to put some pressure on Biden and working alongside Elizabeth Warren and others in the Senate. And so it creates, I think, a dynamic where, Biden wants Congress to do it and Congress wants Biden to do it. And that's, divide and conquer. I think that's a good and interesting dynamic that now the political playing field has moved and people, and at least the Democratic Party feels like it's actually something they have to be answerable for. And that's not something that was true the last Democratic administration by a long shot. So we're in, I think, favorable terrain. That's the brief thing I'll say.
Yeah, to add to that, Luke and I really got deeply into this work fighting the Obama administration. So under the Obama administration, we helped organize with our wonderful comrades at the Debt Collective a debt strike of borrowers who had attended predatory for-profit colleges. And they were called the Corinthian 15. It grew into hundreds. We, Luke was a huge part of this, developing a legal strategy that ended up, helping show that relief, that the federal government can be forced to issue relief, right? That showed that debt cancellation is possible. And so the Debt Collective, recognizes that the Biden administration is different than the Trump administration. And in some ways, we are in a better position than we were under the Obama era, because debt cancellation is now, we've been pushing for it for so long and engaged in this fight for so long that now it's something that's out there and actually sounds like common sense to people. So that's progress in a way. And, Biden he campaigned on 10,000 of immediate relief, but also more substantive debt cancellation, actually debt relief. It's means tested, it needs legislation, but we've got an incoming administration that recognizes that actually cancellation is how you deal with it. Now we want to push them further, push them to wipe the slate. The Debt Collective, building off of that Corinthian debt strike I mentioned, has launched the Biden Jubilee 100. So a new strike campaign demanding full cancellation. I think the thing is, this is what we're owed. We actually are entitled to this. People are entitled to having their debts abolished because this is a broken, failed system. And it was a mistake. I think part of the thing is that student loans are so new in terms of being this widespread that the people who made this broken system are still in power. they're attached to it. It's, and we need to force them to recognize the truth, which is that this does not work. It was a policy mistake, and it needs to be, we don't need some new broken public service loan program. We don't need means testing that's going to leave people behind. We don't need more bureaucracy. we need a real solution. But I think this is promising terrain. We have a window. COVID is part of that. The pandemic we're in is part of that. It makes this idea, more palatable to some people. And what we need to do is keep pushing the big moral argument, the ethical argument. This isn't just about economics, and try to take advantage of this. So I think that's why I think it's so great that YDSA has signed on to debt cancellation in this moment. We really have a moment now to push together.
I'd like to speak to, the question is how did the start of the Biden administration impact the movement? I want to talk about the start of the Biden administration as 10 months into the COVID moratorium, right? For 10 months, we have had the experience of not having to pay student loans, which, on average is $400 a month. People have had the experience of being able to keep that $400 for survival during this pandemic, for being able to help others during this pandemic, to save, savings are up. I think that experience is incredibly powerful, and the new polling has actually shown it. The new polling shows for about 55 to 65% of all voters, not just Democratic voters, but Democrat, Republican, Independent. There is a plurality of the American electorate as of the last poll, which was just about a month ago, that wants the student debt cancellation. Why? Because we have the experience of it. I don't think people, especially, are going to want to go back, honestly, after this experience. And it is an incredible opportunity for us to say, look at what's possible, right? With a moratorium, just keep it going indefinitely, right?
Great, thank you all. So the next question that I have is, how has the movement for debt cancellation / debt abolition developed over the past few years? And I'm going to pass that to Astra first.
And I see a question in the chat about the phrase forgiveness or cancellation. The Debt Collective purposefully talks about debt abolition, right? And this gets to what the person in the question asked, which is, we object to the term forgiveness because it implies that debtors are blameworthy. And we don't think that you're blameworthy if you've taken out debt because you're underpaid, you're being robbed by your boss. We don't think that you are to blame if you have medical bills or if you have student loans because you wanted to get an education. So we want to flip the moral finger here and say, actually, the system's to blame. The creditors are the real moral hazard here. So I think that's important. So we've been developing, when we've been at this for a while. So we had people who founded the Debt Collective. I wasn't one of them. I was around Occupy Wall Street, organized what we called 1T Day, the day student debt passed $1 trillion. That was in November 2012. Now we're at 1.7 trillion. So I think this is part of why we really don't, we want more than $10,000 or $50,000 of debt canceled, because that just brings us back to 1T Day, right? The day we marked under the Obama-Biden administration. Because what happens is interest compounds and debt goes up. I think what we've seen with the movement is that, we've gained force and numbers and legitimacy. And that's part of, the work of organizing, right? Is one thing, like going to people and being like, this thing that's a source of shame that stresses you out, well, let's talk about it in public. Let's see that it's not a personal problem. It's actually a lot of people are in the same boat. So I think there's a lot less shame and stigma around student debt than there was when I defaulted over around 12 years ago. So I think that that's enormous. I think that we've shown that debtors united can actually win. So again, going back to that Corinthian debt strike, people got their debts canceled. Their lives were improved. They got a piece of their future back, and it showed it was possible. That also inspired, people close to Elizabeth Warren. It shifted policymakers' perspective and changed the nature of the inside game that was happening. And that's really important. So I think, and part of organizing is being strategic. It's cultivating, an inside game and an outside game. It's knowing that it's not enough to just have a seat at the table or have the rational economic arguments, right? We have to be disruptive. We have to engage in some forms of making people uncomfortable. And so that's what's led us to this point where we've launched the Biden Jubilee 100 and where this movement is taking off. But, I think what we've done is put a lot of pressure on, on political officials, and also just kept working in the sphere of the public imagination and showing people like, hey, it's actually not that radical to imagine your debt doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I thought Mel's point is great. We've had 10 years now of seeing what that's like. And what that means is actually that Donald Trump has given more student debt relief than any Democrat. And more, more than Joe Biden to date. So at least there's some strange kind of bar being set there. It's very odd.
Yeah, one of the things I think we've also seen is that, again, just as student debt affects all sectors of society, we are seeing a lot of folks coming into the movement to cancel student debt. So the Debt Collective is with us in the and we were working together in the Cancel Student Debt campaign. We also have faculty associations, so the Council of UC Faculty Associations Coalition. We have student organizations. So it's not just kind of a school thing, right? So we've got students, faculty. Our Revolution is in our coalition as well. So and we are seeing sort of broad sectors of society really start to mobilize, and I do think that the critical mass is definitely either approaching or here to really do this big push to get out of the debt trap. And I can speak a little bit to more the other sort of side of the trap, which really is college fees in general and college tuitions in general, and free college being a part of that.
Hey, thanks. So the next question that I have is, what tactics and sources of leverage can we use to pressure the Biden administration to cancel student debt? And I'm going to pass that to Astra first.
Yeah. I think that I put something in the chat, but someone told me the hyperlinks weren't working. So definitely, join YDSA's campaign to cancel student debt, join the Debt Collective's campaign, in our calls and working groups. I mean, I think, right now we are in a moment that's very much focused on this administration, their promises, and pushing the envelope on those. I mean, I think that's just the reality of the political landscape at this moment. So I think it's really important that we pressure whoever our representatives are in Congress, in Congress and in the Senate, because ultimately, building on this idea of executive action, what we're asking them is we're asking them to demand the president act, and politicians love to pass the buck, so we want them, we want to build on this momentum of representatives, getting on board with the idea that that Biden can use his authority, of course, and there's no reason we can't have both. We can have debt cancellation through Congress. We can have debt cancellation also through executive action. And this is important because actually compromise and settlement can't erase private loans, and private loans, as people know who have them, are a huge issue. So we still have the problem of privately held student loans. We also need, actions at the local level. So the Debt Collective is starting to plan some direct actions and protests. We'd love to partner with other groups on that, because I think it's important that we have a disruptive element and that we make clear that these are issues in our community. So for example, we've been doing protests centered in Philadelphia to underscore the fact that it's cities like Philadelphia, you can make a case for it in particular, that delivered the election. Right. And so Biden, it's an example of a community, Biden owes Philly. Student debt is sucking resources and wealth from exactly the working class communities, the Black voters, the struggling families who actually won the election for him. So he owes those communities. So we're organizing protests. And then I think we need to figure out how to leverage this moment where there's attention on student debt cancellation to the horizon of college for all, to actually fixing this problem in a deep and structural way. And I think that does involve more actions in institutions, on campuses. We need to figure out how to build united fronts there. And, but not just universities, also the surrounding communities. How would college towns change if college was a public good? How would that actually benefit us all? Like, I think we need to, again, think with that socialist lens of how this would be good for everybody, so that we get beyond the usual suspects of like, oh yeah, you're talking about education though, so this is like a student and professor issue. I mean, I'm not a student or a professor, but I care about this because I actually care about there being a world where something as important as education is funded in a different way, and where the people who I share my city with, aren't buried in these debts that are destroying their lives and hurting their families.
Just to jump in very briefly, I just wanted to follow up on Astra's point at the end there about how it's now a sort of strike while the iron is hot moment to get as much debt cancellation as we can. But I think the other way to think about this moment is, as people who are organizing for a deep transformation in society well beyond any particular policy, that this is also a moment to flex your muscles, to build some power, and to start thinking and talking about what is the next move. I think, one thing that really inspired me recently, I think it's UC Davis. It was one of the UC campuses that was like using its resources to open up testing and rooms to the community for people who needed to quarantine for a COVID, to be tested for COVID. Right. I'm at Yale right now. It's just like huge amount of resources that are devoted to faculty and students, free testing all the time, et cetera, nothing for the community. It's totally not a public vision, but like this amazing vision of a much less resourced campus opening itself to the community. I think thinking about universities as like space, like local spaces where resources can be distributed into a community, cultural resources, medical resources, knowledge, legal help, all these things that exist at universities, it would have been a great way to do vaccine rollout, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, using this space to start having conversations about how can we think differently about what a university is, about what this space is, which is a set of conversations that can build for a next, like a longer term campaign about what do these conversations look like on campus, and then later with legislatures, right? But now is striking at the iron while the iron is hot to get some debt cancellation.
Yeah. So when we think about like by any means necessary, we have lots of means, right? So there's the executive action, there's legislative action, but there's also the fact that the data supports it. At a time when everybody wants to talk about reviving the economy, how are we going to do that with COVID, all of that stuff. Freedom to Prosper, who is also in our coalition, has there's lots of studies out there too that kind of like talk about how the actual economy itself can thrive when you put that money back into the hands of the people, so that it's not just really when we talk about student loan debt, what we're really talking about is upward redistribution of wealth to finance, right? So many people who, they take out 10,000, they are like, oh, 10,000 is okay. And then they end up, 10, 20 years later, they've paid 30,000 and they still owe 40,000, right? That's theft, y'all. It's legalized theft. But, and to think about it in those terms, to think about when you're giving your money away, thinking that you're paying something back, you're actually like, giving more and more than you even got out of it in the first place. And I think again, with when the moratorium lifts, that reality is going to hit like a ton of bricks for a lot of people. But we do have almost like a really critical mass type sort of set of tools to make the case. We have the data, we have the polling, we have multiple avenues of government action that would actually that can actually make this a reality. So when people say it's not realistic, that's just not true. And the data out there supports it. The experiences of people support it. The only one it doesn't support are the people who are getting rich off of it.
Great, thanks so much. So the next question that I had is, how can we organize to cancel and ultimately abolish other kinds of debt besides just student debt? And so I'm going to pass that to Astra first.
Yeah, this is the question that, if framed not by our wonderful interlocutor here, is usually a tweet by a Republican or a conservative on Twitter that's like, what, you want me to cancel student debt and then your credit card bills and then your rent and what's next? And the answer we give is always like, yes, that is exactly right. Because this is, again, part of a bigger system. Someone asked in the chat about neoliberalism. Again, our economy has shifted. You can call this process neoliberalism, financialization, but we are forced to use debt more and more for the things that we need to survive. And so I absolutely think there's enormous potential. I mean, the basis of the debt collective is the idea that organizing around these different types of debt opens up new strategies for us to fight for a more just system. So I wrote something here, instead of going into a lot of details, actually I have the wrong link. This is a wrong thing. This is a film that talks about what public college could be. That just went up. It sort of like has a bit of this horizon. This is a piece in The Nation that talks about various kinds of debts and what could actually be done, how medical debts could possibly be canceled. Also looks at municipal debts. But I think there's enormous power. I welcome people to join the debt collective so that we can start thinking and experimenting on these fronts. When you think that, we began with this thought experiment years ago. Well, what would happen if student debtors got organized and refused to pay their loans and treated this as the political problem it is? Well, look at this conversation we're having right now. I totally agree that this is a moment, and that debt cancellation is actually objectively low-hanging fruit. This is actually something that we can win, So yeah, let's organize after this and figure out what a medical debtors union would be, and target all of these hospitals around the country who are selling off their emergency rooms to private equity and not giving people the free services that they are legally entitled to, and bearing people in medical debt, and even causing people to be it's sent to jail. I mean, this is deeply wrong, and we should be organizing about it because, there's actually so much more, there's so much potential in the space. And once again, we cannot afford to leave power on the table. And that's what we're by not organizing around these forms of extraction and punishment. I agree with the person in the Q&A. This is something that we should be outraged about, and that we can turn from a form of oppression into a form of power to change the system.
Hey, thank you.
Just say one brief thing on this, Emmaline. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I just wanted to briefly mention that canceling student debt is going to be good for people. And a lot of people don't think that. So it just opens up new possibilities. Cancel student debt. Oh, actually that the whole world didn't collapse. So now let's talk about medical debt. So now let's talk about fines and fees. Let's talk about bail bonds, right? Let's think more broadly about all the forms of debt that exist out there and how they make people unfree. And just one more thing I'll say, which is that there's so many people signing on right now to for whatever reason, whatever set of contingencies, COVID or whatever, progressive groups, relatively centrist groups are signing letters and telling the Biden administration cancel student debt. Well, if they believe in that, why don't they believe in canceling these other forms of debt? I think it's also a place to find leverage for other sort of civil society or organizations who might not be in the deep struggle for socialism to maybe push them on these other areas.
Okay, thanks, Luke. So the next question that I had is, how could we use the demand for student debt cancellation as part of a movement for free college for all and decommodifying education? And related to that, how is the movement for college for all impacted by the current crisis of austerity in higher education? And I'm going to pass that to Melezia first.
Okay, for this, I'm going to sort of show a slide real quick to show a little bit of how this is correlating with the rise in obviously tuitions, but also living expenses. So if we look at this slide right here, which says that student debt has more than tripled since the Great Recession, reaching a total of 1.6 trillion nationally. And we can see that actually the rise in student debt is pretty directly correlated, not just with the rise in student tuition since 2000 that has grown exponentially because of austerity, but also because of the vast almost exponential rise in living expenses like rent and just the cost of living. And this, this is completely unsustainable. And I think everybody kind of knows it. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why, lawmakers are starting to sort of seriously look at this, is just the realities are going to hit like a ton of bricks. So again, one-time student debt cancellation is not, or even the partial thing, giving, $50,000, it's absolutely not going to fix it, because this snowball effect of all the different things that are leading to people to take out more and more debt and be in more and more debt is just going to continue. And so we really cannot, this is not a separate issue from College for All. It really has to be come together. It's kind of the mirror opposite of the conservative argument. Isn't that not fair to people who already paid it off? Well, it's not fair to people who are going to come after us as well. And so that's why we need to we need to push for these twin issues that go together. There's and again, there's many means for that too. There's the College for All bills that are coming through, but even on the state level, I think so two of our partners, the Council of UC Faculty Associations and PDA, is going to have an event later this month on the $66 fix. And this is California specific, but it doesn't have to be, in that how again, just a $66 increase can make higher education free in California, and bring back the dream of the master plan, which was free college for all in California. And so I think Constance put the link in there, 66fix.org. Again, would you rather pay $400 a month for the rest of your life, or $66 a year and have free college for you, your siblings, your whole family, and everybody else who wants an education? I think this is, again, thinking about education as a social asset and a human right to better ourselves, to live self-determined lives, is something that, again, a one-time debt cancellation is not going to fix. And that the whole suite of problems that has led up to this situation has to be rolled back. And so to a place where people are able to get an education and not have to worry about being in a debt trap for the rest of their lives. So to me, these issues are one and the same, and we have to fight for all of it.
I just want to say two brief things, which is one, co-sign to everything Mel just said. Really crucial really crucial set of points. One thing I would add is that, canceling student debt, one question I constantly get, an objection I get to canceling student debt, is this is a moral hazard problem, because now whatever, colleges are going to raise their tuition or students are going to take out more debt. And what that is really just saying is there's going to be more debt, right? It doesn't fix the problem. So one thing is, canceling student debt forces the problem for every subsequent generation. Why should they have to pay this debt? Right. And that question is going to be open, and we should be prepared to answer that question. And we should be thinking beyond, what does a basic free college plan look like? We should think more broadly. How do we think about what this transformed higher education system looks like? I think that's a real opening. We should think about it. The second point I want to make is, if I can remember it, that, the potentially weird coalitions that happen here. Who needs to get, let me step back. A lot of colleges are in desperate straits right now. Some colleges are doing just fine, right? But most colleges, many public universities and many small private universities are really struggling, in part because of COVID, but for, on top of everything else. So there should be people at those universities, administrators, people that we might even think as evil administrators, who are ready to get on the side of, hey, we need public funding for higher education. Some of these private colleges probably should close in favor of public colleges, but we can think more broadly. Well, hey, why don't they demand funding? It used to be much more common for institutions to demand institutional funding. Until relatively recently, I'm talking about 30, 40 years, that's when colleges started to shift to be, all right, we're on board with more debt because we know that's fine for us. It works out okay. It used to be, before student debt was really a big thing, that colleges said, no, don't provide loans or even Pell Grants, right? Fund us directly, right? Why can't can we bring that back, right? Maybe this is a moment when we can start to have conversations with people we may not usually have conversations with.
Great, thanks so much. So we have one more question left in the sort of like pre-planned question, and we'll move to audience questions. I do want to make a couple of just boost some announcements though. So first is definitely get involved in the YDSA student debt cancellation campaign if you haven't yet, and I'm going to drop the link to that again. We have phone banks and other things, and you can also join YDSA here if you aren't yet, and be part of this organization in the long term and organizing around issues like this. And also we're having WinterCon and that'll be really fun. And I think, yeah, Anna, if you want to pull up the poll about volunteering for the student debt campaign, that would be awesome. So basically, whatever sort of commitment you want to take to help us cancel debt, just let us know in this poll. I see a lot of people committing to phone banking, starting a new YDSA chapter. That's exciting. We have 9 new YDSA chapters on this call. Yeah, so basically we're phone banking people to talk to them about why this is an important demand, and also to help them start up YDSA chapters at their school. So we're phone banking existing DSA members who are students, but not in YDSA yet, to like help them start up chapters, help them organize more people at their schools around this issue. And so the goal is to sort of like, raise consciousness about this demand, and also sort of build the lasting power that we need to win this demand, and also other demands around down the line, like college for all. So I'm going to share these poll results now so you can see how everyone's committing to help out with this campaign. And that's really exciting. We have 17 people committing to starting a new YDSA chapter. Then I see someone asking, how do we start a chapter? And basically what you need is just to join YDSA and then find some other people on your campus who are interested in being part of it as well. And you can talk with Anna. I think Anna just dropped the link you can fill out, and Anna can follow up with you and provide you more support. And yeah, there are trainings every week on how to start a chapter. Oh, and I might have to send that again. But yeah, this is really exciting, and it's really cool to be part of this movement with all of you, and to be growing YDSA and amplifying this demand for student debt cancellation and building power. So that kind of leads us into the last question that I had, which is basically, how does student organizing, so just to kind of frame this question, like YDSA, we're an organization of students, not necessarily of debtors, and so sort of how does student organizing specifically fit into this movement for debt cancellation? And I'm going to pass that to Astra first, and then I'll also add some things onto that.
Yeah, I think you're the real expert here, more than me. I haven't been a student in a long time, but I mean, I think obviously there's so much alignment, right? I mean, students are paying the tuition, whether they're taking out loans to do it, that we're trying, it's almost like, yeah, let's try to solve this problem before you have to pay that lifetime of debt, before you have to, experience the default, right? Before this problem gets even worse. And so one thing, I think it's so important that we fight where we are, right? So we have these federal demands, right? We want federally funded public education. I think we've seen in the pandemic that the only real sustainable source of revenue for resilient institutions is public money. So, but at your university, fight over tuition hikes. That's why the tuition strike is so important that's happening at Columbia. And sure, you agreed to sign up and go to this school, but it doesn't make it right. The costs are absolutely ridiculous. They're out of control, and it should be politicized. I'm thinking right now of, I'm radically simplifying this story, but there were massive student strikes in Quebec in 2012. And in Quebec, they have, basically what we would consider free public education compared to the American model. And it's fees are much, much lower than in the rest of Canada, in Anglo Canada. And I will never forget that my friends in Toronto, where I was living at the time, I'm Canadian, were, mocking the students in Quebec for protesting. And they were like, what? They're protesting over like a $70 tuition hike. And it's like, but the lesson they should have taken was that's how you keep the tuition where it should be, by being militant, by being organized, by protesting every little incremental attempt to chip away at the public goods you're entitled to. So I think, we absolutely need student action and awareness on this campaign. And I also think we can look into the specifics of our universities, just like there are divestment campaigns calling for divestment from fossil fuels. Look at the debt the institutions are in. What economic financial relationships are happening at the university level, and who's profiting from those financial arrangements. I mean, different debt contracts are playing out at different levels of our society, and there's different strategies that are emerging on that front as well. So I think once you also put it in this lens of thinking about finance in this way, you'll see that there's actually probably some interesting strategies at whatever institution you're at. But definitely, feel entitled, feel entitled to have your debt canceled, feel entitled to have your tuition reduced, because it's not a selfish demand. It's a demand that it really is for everyone.
Yeah, I'll just add some things on, and to give, I guess, a bit of context for anyone who might not be familiar with the campaign at Columbia. So our YDSA chapter at Columbia started up this movement, which kind of like spiraled out and became something much larger than we had ever imagined it would be, with this tuition strike, which started out kind of as a simple pressure campaign to try to call for a tuition reduction and increase in financial aid, and then eventually evolved into other demands as well around defunding campus police, divesting from Israel, divesting from fossil fuels, and bargaining with labor unions on campus as well. And it kind of went from, a small group of like a couple hundred people in the first few weeks, and kind of exploded into now the current number is 4,300 students signing on in support of these lists of demands that we had in this tuition strike, that we're going on to try to achieve those. And I think it's still going on currently. It started in January, and there are at least 1,000 and possibly as much as almost 3,000 people currently withholding tuition. And, we, won some important victories like fossil fuel divestment. And I think, I think even more important than that is the sort of sense of potential that it's given people. I know that there are students at CUNY who have been sort of inspired by, example, Free CUNY, who are thinking of a tuition strike. There are students at Howard who are thinking of this as well and sort of actively planning it out. So the hope is that this could lead to some sort of national movement. And of course, it doesn't have to be a tuition strike necessarily, but like some sort of militant action, just like Astra is saying, keeping in mind these powerful examples like the Quebec student strikes. It could be a Herrine strike. There are students in Manchester, University of Manchester, who are going on Herrine strike across campuses. And that was a really powerful tactic. They won major concessions from their administrations. And I think all of this is part of sort of building up student power around the issue of rising tuition, student debt, and really like how do we win education as a human right? Because people really are radicalizing around this, and even if they aren't like feeling the material impact of debt just yet, they're feeling it in terms of the impact that it has on our education. Just like Astra was saying earlier, like we are compelled into this sort of like narrow economic logic where we have to think of not education in terms of its liberating potential as something that helps us to become full human beings, but we have to think of it as something that we are sort of like sacrificing our economic security for, and we have to sort of justify that to ourselves by saying, okay, I'm going to like take this like high paying job after graduation, and it might be something that's very sort of soul crushing. Think of the way that people, you know, go into law school and they take on all this debt, and they you know, think they want to become like a public defender and help people, but instead they have to go into, you know, like something like corporate law and just kind of defend the existing status quo. Or the way that, you know, I'm becoming a public school teacher, and I'm taking on so much debt, and it's kind of like, if I did not have so much motivation to like do this, like it would be very daunting, and that kind of like has so much to do with the way that certain professions are sort of underdeveloped in this capitalist, are sort of undervalued in this capitalist system, and you know, because they're not highly compensated enough, people, you know, are sort of discouraged from doing them because it just is such a huge barrier, this debt. And so I think that, you know, people are, this is kind of a burden hanging over people when they're in school. And I think that there's really, I think that what Columbia shows us is there's such a huge potential for turning that away from just kind of like individual despair into collective action. And it's kind of like, you know, thinking of this moments of COVID, especially when this issue of non-payments and like sort of withdrawing payment, I think became more politicized when you saw more tactics like rent strikes, like debt strikes, and now tuition strikes. Of like, if like the working class is, you know, constantly forced into this position where we can't pay for things, and we're sort of denied basic, what should be basic human rights, whether it's housing, education, or just like food. And, you know, when we can't pay for those things, we are sort of like left at the mercy of landlords and capitalists and university administrations. But when we politicize that and turn it into a collective action, then we have considerable power. But of course, the challenge is that we need sort of a super majority of people on our side, and like what kind of institutions can we build to actually build that power where it becomes a collective action. And I think that collective is doing that. I think YDSA is doing that through, you know, building up student organizations across the nation. You know, tenants unions are doing that. And so I think we just need to keep doing that work. And yeah, I think that YDSA's Cancel Student Debt campaign is a really important part of that. And hopefully, you know, that can translate to sort of local actions across different YDSA chapters as well. So unless any of the panelists also want to jump in on this question, I think we have a ton of audience Q&A and just like 15 minutes left in this call. So I don't know how I'm going to choose among these different questions. But if any of you see anything that stands out to you, feel free to jump in and address it.
There's a question about how to dispel the bootstraps ideology that many of this questioner's classmates still cling to. There are a variety of different versions of this. I thought I might float this, and then my co-panelists might also have a couple answers, because I do think this is a common thread. You know, it depends on exactly the nature of the objection, but like one way to go about dispelling this myth is to cite data. I don't know, not that many people are that into this, but you know, it's pretty easy to show that, you know, the amount of the debt you get into is not going to be enough to pay, or the amount of income you get in most jobs that are feasible in the near future is not going to be enough to pay most people's debts for a very long time. So maybe a more moral version of the argument is can we really blame any individual for huge amounts of debt, or expect anyone to get out of debt when we see the amount of debt that people are getting into rising collectively, when we see the amount of people going into a default increasing over time? Is it that everybody is simultaneously making bad decisions by chance? Or there's some like cultural disease that's spreading through our society? Or are there deeper structural problems that we have to address? I don't know if other folk, if Mel or Astra have anything to say on that.
I'm getting into typing answers over here.
Yeah.
Someone asked, I do want to answer what was a very practical question. So someone was the same person, I think, Stephanie, who asked about Can't Pay, Won't Pay. It's a book that the Debt Collective co-authored. Activism is thinking together, developing an analysis together, right? So the book is a co-authored account of that thinking and thinking about why debt resistance, why debtors unions are important, and and complement all these other forms of organizing we do, whether we're organizing for workers' rights, racial justice, environmental justice, even. So it's short. We tried to make it short and sweet. Please do check it out. But someone asked, should people not pay their loans right now? Well, the thing is, because of the suspension, student loans have been suspended. So this is an interesting moment. We're in this
If you have
strange
federal,
period.
most federal
Loans,
student loans.
yeah. Federal student loans, right. So those are being suspended. I don't recommend, I wouldn't recommend a campaign of not paying your private student loans right now. Again, I also want to say that, an individual default, which I went through, is not a debt strike. We're talking about collective strategic campaigns of economic disobedience, where we're thinking about acting together, what the levers of potential power are, be they, sort of legal claims or, moral claims, and doing media pushes and stuff. So definitely not something you do on your own. But another aspect of that is that before COVID, over 1 million people were defaulting on their student loans every year. And so one thing we want to do is invite people who are already in that condition to come out of the shadows and politicize the reality, the truth of where we're at economically, right? Because that is, I really do believe there will a kind of power numbers will come out of that, right? It's like there's so much isolation. And so, if those 1 million people had come out and started fighting for student debt cancellation and making a lot of noise about it years and years ago, that would be a powerful force to be reckoned with. So I think it's also important to say that, a lot of people are already suffering the worst consequences of non-payment.
Right, so one person asked, can you explain more on how neoliberalism plays into student debt? Anyone interested in responding to that one?
I think Astra said, if anyone's a neoliberal, Ronald Reagan is, and he was a neoliberal before his time. It depends on how you tell the story of neoliberalism, but I think on pretty much any version of the story, what is the increase of student debt? It's defunding public goods. It's defunding public goods at the moment when increasing percentages of Black and brown people had access to higher education in an explicitly, racialized moment, but also in a response to a growing, an institution that was providing a safe haven and a safe space for experimentation with other ways of thinking about society. And that is definitely part of the neoliberal project, going back to the early opposition to the New Deal, the early neoliberals. Eviscerate institutions, defund the left, right? That's part of what defunding higher education is about. And part of the neoliberal vision, this is to treat it as more unified, but there's many sort of neoliberal thinkers, Gary Becker most prominently, but like most economists now think of things in this way, who think about what is education? It's an investment in future earning capacity. It's human capital, right? And so what is student debt? It's leveraging your investment. It's totally rational economic behavior. You're an entrepreneur of the self, to use Foucault's term, right? And so this is, in a certain way, like a foundational, deeply ideological notion of what it is to be an individual, of what it is to be educated, and of what it is to be useful to society, namely to work for capitalist firms. And if you make more money, that means you're being more useful to other people.
Yeah, just to tie this into again to neoliberalism, I wanted to talk about like student debt and again the both disinvestment and financialization of public institutions, as actually looking at neoliberalism as a crisis of capitalism, right? That since the 1970s, the real economy, what we call the fundamentals, the actual production of goods and services and the buying and selling of goods and services, the profit margins on those have actually declined quite significantly over the last 40 years. Neoliberalism is a response to a decline in the rate of profit in what we call the real economy, like manufacturing and goods and services. And so basically capital is trying to find productive avenues for investment wherever they can. And they're doing it more and more in the financial services realm. So that, again, looking at the experience of California, right? In the 1960s, the California Master Plan was actually planned to make sort of this three-tiered system of community college, Cal State, and UC free for all people in free for all, right? And so college for all is not a new idea; it's an old idea, To frame it in those terms that like college was free, and then all of this capital came in, all of the coming with the defunding of education is actually this is capital's desperation to find as many ways to make profit as they possibly can. And so to think of it in those terms, that it's not necessarily because, oh, it's just more expensive. No, it's more expensive because the finance industry and capital is basically trying to take blood out of a stone, right? To frame it in those terms and to just sort of even internally think of it in those terms is a real antidote to the kind of bootstrap ideology that you hear out there. So once you understand that actually it's capital that wants that's so desperate to get your money that it is willing to trap you into this cycle, then you understand that. When you understand it that way, and your friends understand it that way, and the people you're organizing with it understand it that way, that gives you that leverage to say, no, we're going to fight back on it, and we're going to say, no, this avenue is closed to you. And so debt cancellation and college for all basically is closing the door and saying, no, you cannot make profit off of our right to an education. That's it.
Yeah, just quickly to add to that, because someone asked about what our opinion on Black and Brown students who can't even get a private student loan because we don't have families who can co-sign. I think it's important to highlight that something that happened too in this phase that we call neoliberalism is the quote unquote, the democratization of credit, right? In other words, so everybody gets access to these financial services. And some sociologists use a really useful term, including Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who probably people have heard of here, and it's predatory inclusion. That, okay, yeah, you want access to a better life, but we're gonna actually include you, but on these predatory terms, right? So terms that actually strip the benefit away from you. So we see, huge numbers of Black and Brown students, first generation students, single mothers going into for-profit colleges, right? Which actually ultimately penalizes them for having the nerve to pursue upward mobility, right? It becomes this sort of, it costs them more than the supposed or promised benefit. So I think it's all part of the same, shift that we're talking about. Someone also just said, and I think this neoliberal shift in the mindset, right? That we see ourselves, as Luke said, as little entrepreneurs of the self, is connected to someone's question about how do you bring in other people to this movement? I often find it really interesting because people immediately go like, well, what's in it for me, right? I canceled, I paid off my student loans. Am I going to get a refund? I personally did pay off my student loans, so I don't have anything to gain from this conversation. If I think individually, if I think like a little neoliberal subject, but if I think as a human being who cares about the social world, then I see that there are all these benefits that wonderful students like Emmaline can go and be teachers. Like public school teachers. That's good for society. That people can become general practitioners when they go to medical school instead of like plastic surgeons. This is like kind of good for society. So I think we actually, like, as we make the arguments to our friends and our families and our colleagues, we actually part of what we have to do is like put the social and the public back into the center of the debate, right? And de-individualize it a bit. So hopefully that works. I don't know. My friends and family have heard me go on about this for so long that I think they just pretend to agree with me that all student debt needs to go. So I'll shut up. There's also just that war of attrition.
And so Artemis asked, I think, a really interesting question. What do y'all think the likelihood of success for a national student strike is? And this is something that I think we're definitely hoping for. And I think that, Astra earlier cited a really important historical precedent of the Quebec student strike, which involved at least tens of thousands, possibly more students, across Quebec, skipping out on their classes, going on strike, and creating massive disruption around this issue of tuition increases. And I think that there's unfortunately an important difference between the Quebec situation and the US situation, that Quebec had a very strong student union movement. And they had these various militant student movements that, were pre-existing democratic structures where you could sort of make the decision of are we gonna accept this tuition hike? Are we gonna, push back against it? And, they decided they were gonna push back against it, and they could, sort of collectively make the decision to engage in a sort of, collective withdrawal of themselves as students. And we don't have anything like that in the US. And that's a major limitation. And we don't even have that, on the individual university level, much less nationwide. And so I think that one of my sort of long-term goals for YDSA as a student organization is to sort of develop those kinds of structures that we can use to sort of engage students in that kind of collective action that can really have an impact on university administrations, and also even at a broader level on sort of national policy around education. And I think that if one of my hopes for the tuition strike at Columbia is to sort of maybe start to create that sort of student union sort of structure by sort of okay, these 4,000 people, what happens when the tuition strike ends? We don't want them to just become unorganized again. We want to use this as a moment to sort of organize them and take further action and possibly set up some sort of structures for similar actions in the future. Because we all know that this is a long-term struggle and not just something that's just sort of about the pandemic or whatever. It's, a sort of something we'll need to continue to struggle around the following semester. And so I think that at the moment, maybe we're not in the place where a national student strike could happen, but we want to do everything that we can to get to that place. And because that's when we'll really start exercising real power, just like they did in Quebec in 2012. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that as well. But if not,
fan of Quebec student unions over here. It's really they're amazing. In 2012, I met these 17-year-olds who were in the union and they're CEGEP, and I was like, they know more about strategy and democracy, how to actually do democracy, than social movement veterans, who've been around forever in the US, because they were actually organized. So it was kind of interesting.
I think we just maybe have time for one more question, because we're definitely getting towards the end. So Daniel said, I believe it was Luke who talked about ways to reimagine colleges as a public good / place. Could you elaborate more on that? I don't know if Luke, you want to address that?
Sure, let me say a couple of things, but I think this is a great way to end, because we should be thinking about the future we want, not just the things we don't want about our present. This is something that I feel like I've underthought about, and we just think about not enough together. But the initial type of thinking that I've done on this, and then I would love to do more with other folks and in conversations we should be having, is to think about colleges as, I think it's the urbanist literature that refers to them as anchor institutions. And these are it's buildings that are in all over the country, right? Like post offices in a certain way, right? That are cultural havens, places where people do research and think and move more slowly, ideally, right? I mean, it's been neoliberalized in a lot of ways, but provide medical, do medical research, provide medical services, do legal research, provide legal services. These are institutions that all of that can be built out, right? These can be spaces where people can teach together, not just for like 4 years, you know, at a time, but rather like there can be open spaces for people in a community to come in and learn, to get medical treatment, to have access to COVID testing, to quarantine if they need to quarantine. Like that's the sort of stuff that we've seen going on at UC Davis. And we can think more broadly about it. Like why we have these institutions, we have people here, we have smart people, we have people who are interested in being socially, you know, useful and productive. So it seems to me that that's the sort of thing that we should be talking about. And the sort of benefit of that in terms of thinking structurally about how that fits into a monetary system and a sort of political system is that, you know, if you make public higher education free, you have federal money flowing directly to institutions that then can provide education, can, you know, provide what they currently provide, but, you know, take away a lot of layers of administrative bloat that don't need to happen and increase services. You know, hey, we want more, we want better hospitals, we want a better public, you know, medical system. Let's just move funding away from private hospitals and towards university hospitals, right? And build new university hospitals. We want better legal services. Why don't we do it through, you know, we want better COVID testing. Why don't we go through universities? I mean, and other institutions, libraries and the like. But we can think about these, you know, places that exist now as places where funding can get to people in a community and also educate people in the meantime.
I think it's surprising sometimes to people to understand that it really wasn't that long ago that colleges were considered a public good, and it was considered like a place again where learning can happen. It's really only in the last couple of decades that it has come way more into a consumer model, that like you're going to consume an education and that teachers are service workers who have giving you a service so that you can go out and get a job. All of this, this narrative around what college is has really dramatically shifted in the last generation. And so again, it's not a new dream to reimagine it. It's to go back to that basic function of what education means in a society. I think anyone would say after this whole debacle with COVID and masks and everything that we would probably want more educated people in the world instead of less. And not only that, to have the colleges as this space where we can get the best, you know, where minds can come together with equal, you know, with equal opportunity. I mean, the more that I think about how inaccessible colleges are becoming, how inaccessible education is becoming, I keep thinking about, you know, all of the potential, you know, vaccine innovators and all of, and in the world of climate change, we need more minds than ever before to come together and try to work out the challenges of this century like never before. And to offer that to be able to have free college and offer that opportunity for collective thinking and collective working out of the unprecedented challenges we face can only be a public good. And so, you know, it's again, it really is about undoing the financialization and the neoliberalization of the function of the university, and you know, to again think about a higher education as something that makes the whole society better. It's not a new idea, and that you know, it's just about undoing their narrative, honestly. Thanks.
Yeah, just to build on what people have said, I mean, I think one thing we need to understand or be wary of is that, you know, tuition-free university can still be underfunded. There could still be austerity, right? So you could have tuition be free and the system shrink, right? And infrastructure be insufficient and people be underpaid. So what we want is robustly funded. We want to close the gap between what resources each student gets, massively lift the floor, right, from what people are getting in terms of resources when they attend a community college, and then like shrink the elite, how much resources are going to those elite institutions. And I think we want to push the horizon of thinking about open admissions, right? There were amazing movements to couple free tuition with letting everyone in the door and meeting people what they are and really making that promise of education being accessible to all who want it being real. So I would recommend people look at the history of CUNY and think about open admissions being part of that and what that would mean, how that would challenge our ideas of meritocracy, how that would change our attachment to certain hierarchies that universities are complicit in reproducing. So I think for me, and I think for the Debt Collective, when we talk about free university, we mean free as in cost and free as in aimed at freedom. So that means education that liberates you, that allows you to pursue your potential, your curiosity, but also, you know, it's not a free space. It's not a liberated space if there are racist cops on campus, right? If there's excessive policing, if you're actually there because the institution is perpetuating some violence on the community by, you know, buying up property and not being a good neighbor, right? So it means also, I think what Luke is pointing at is these universities being more integrated into the communities they're part of and being part of really serving the public in the broadest possible sense. So for me, that's it. You know, freedom in both of those registers is really vital and should be the horizon that we're working towards.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists. That was really amazing. And I know I'm feeling super inspired to like go do some actions at my school. So yeah, I think I'm just going to have some last announcements real quickly, just reminding you all that Winter Conference is coming up. It's the last weekend in February. So please register. We'll talk way more about student debt cancellation and how you can get involved. And then another thing is you can also volunteer for our student debt cancellation campaign. We do phone banks twice a week, and we're also going to be having more events on this topic. Yeah, and I believe Anna dropped the link for Winter Conference in the chat. And yeah, we're going to have a poll about Winter Conference. So yeah, one more poll, and then we'll be done. Looks like a lot of people are already registered. That's awesome to hear. And I'm glad that people are thinking about registering before Friday. Yeah, and also make sure if you're not a member of YDSA or DSA, make sure to do that. And I saw Emmaline drop the link to that. So that's also in the chat if you are not already a member. Awesome. Well, it looks like 26 people are registered and 20 people are going to be registered. So that's awesome. Great to hear. Thank you all so much for coming, and hopefully we will see you all at Winter Conference.